My sister Dana said it the way people say things they have been thinking for a long time and finally found an excuse to release, not cruelly exactly, not with the deliberate aim of a person who knows they are causing damage, but with the casual carelessness of someone who has never had to think too carefully about the weight of their own words because no one in our family ever made them. And what she said was directed at my 11-year-old daughter Nora, who had been asking the way children ask things, persistently, and without awareness that the question had an edge, asking why she looked different from her cousins, why her hair was a different texture, why her eyes were a different shape. And Dana looked at her across the kitchen counter with the slightly impatient expression she wore when children were being inconvenient, and said, "Well, maybe because you were adopted," and then laughed and said, "I'm joking." Obviously I'm joking, and Nora laughed too because Nora was 11 and had not yet developed the machinery to process the thing underneath a joke that calls itself a joke immediately after it lands. And my husband James was standing in the doorway of the kitchen where Dana could not see him, and I was not in the room at all. I was upstairs, and James stood in that doorway and heard it and did not say anything in the moment, carried it upstairs to where I was folding laundry on our bed. And when he told me, his face had an expression I had not seen on it before, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. I need to tell you who Dana is before I tell you what happened next, because Dana without context is a villain, and Dana with context is something more complicated and more true. Dana is my older sister by 4 years. She is the person who taught me to ride a bicycle, and who held my hand at our father's funeral, and who calls me on my birthday without fail every single year. She's also a person who grew up in the same house I grew up in and absorbed the same lesson I absorbed, which was that feelings were for managing privately and words were casual things you threw around without tracking where they landed. And she learned this lesson more thoroughly than I did because she was 4 years older and had 4 more years of practice before I arrived to dilute the dynamic. And what this means is that Dana can love you completely and hurt you carelessly at the same time, can hold both of those things without apparent awareness that they are in conflict. And for most of my life, I had accepted this about her the way you accept weather as something that exists independently of your preferences and must simply be navigated. Nora is not adopted. I want to say that plainly because the specifics matter. She's not adopted. She looks different from her cousins because her father is James, who is mixed race, and her cousin's father is Dana's husband, who is not. And the reason she looks different is the most ordinary genetic reason in the world. And Dana knows this, has always known this, and the joke was a joke in the technical sense that it was not true. And it was not a joke in any sense that matters because Nora is 11 and was asking a genuine question about herself and received in response a suggestion, even a laughing one, even immediately retracted one, that she did not belong where she thought she belonged. And that suggestion had landed somewhere in my daughter before Dana's laugh could retrieve it. James told me, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding a folded shirt, and I thought about Nora's face the way I always thought about Nora's face when something happened, scanning back through my memory of the evening to find her expression. And I could not locate the moment Dana said it because I had not been there, could only locate the image of Nora at dinner 20 minutes later, quieter than usual, picking at her food with the particular focus of a child who is thinking about something she has not decided whether to say. And I understood now what she had been thinking about. I went to find her. She was in the room she shared when we visited, sitting on the bed with her book open, but not reading, and I sat next to her and I said, "Hey," and she said, "Hey," back, and I said, "Dad told me what Aunt Dana said in the kitchen." And Nora looked at me immediately, the book forgotten, and she said, "It was just a joke." And I said, "I know she said that," and Nora said, "So it's fine," and I said, "Is it fine?" And she was quiet for long enough that I had my answer. What came out over the next 20 minutes was not simple and not linear. It was 11-year-old language for a thing that had apparently been sitting in her longer than just this evening. A quiet background question about why she looked different that she had been managing alone rather than bringing to me. And the joke, the retracted joke, the "it was just a joke," had touched that quiet background question and made it louder. And what she said at the end of it after the 20 minutes of careful and halting honesty was, "Sometimes I feel like I don't fit in this family the same way the other kids do." And I said, "Which family?" And she said, "Dad's family fits, and your family, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like they're not sure what to do with me." And I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, "You are right, that some of them are not sure what to do with you." And she looked at me and I said, "And that is entirely their problem and not one single piece of yours." James was the one who suggested we leave that night, rather than in the morning as planned, and I did not argue because I had been thinking the same thing and was glad he said it first, glad to not be the one who made the call alone. And we packed quietly and efficiently the way people pack when they are not performing their departure, but simply making it. And I went downstairs to find Dana, who was in the living room watching television. And I said, "We are going to head home tonight." And Dana looked up and immediately read something in my face because Dana knows my face better than almost anyone after a lifetime of sharing parents and holidays and the specific compressed atmosphere of family. And she said, "Sarah, it was a joke." And I said, "I know you think that." And she said, "Nora knows it was a joke." And I said, "Nora is 11 and she has been quietly wondering why she looks different from her cousins, and you handed her the most destabilizing possible answer to that question and then called it a joke." And Dana opened her mouth and closed it, and I said, "I am not angry with you tonight because I understand where this comes from, and it comes from the same place everything in this family comes from, which is nobody ever taught us to think before we spoke. But I need you to know that it landed, and it landed on a child who did not deserve it. And I am going home now, and we will talk about this when I am ready to talk about it." The drive home was quiet in the way that full things are quiet. James driving, Nora in the back seat asleep within 20 minutes, the way children sleep after they have cried, and I sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the dark road and thought about the first time someone said something careless to me that called itself a joke. I was 9 years old. I was at a family gathering not unlike this one. Someone said something about my weight in the particular tone that signals the speaker believes they are being affectionate, and it had landed in me and stayed, and I had not told anyone it had landed because no one had come to find me afterward the way I had gone to find Nora. No one had sat next to me on a bed and said, "Is it fine?" in a tone that meant I already know it isn't. My mother called the next day and I told her what happened, and she said, "Dana didn't mean anything by it." And I said, "I know she didn't mean anything by it. That is actually the part that concerns me most." And my mother said, "You are making this bigger than it is." And I said, "Mom, your granddaughter spent an evening thinking she might not belong in this family because of something her aunt said and called a joke. How big exactly should I be making it?" And my mother was quiet, and then she said, "I will talk to Dana," and I said I would appreciate that. Dana called 4 days later, and the call was uncomfortable and genuine in equal measure. She said she had been thinking about it, and she understood that what she said had not landed as a joke regardless of how it was intended. And she said she was sorry, and I believed her, and I also said, "Dana, I need you to understand something about Nora. She is already doing the work of figuring out where she belongs. And that is hard enough without the people who are supposed to be her safe people making it harder." And Dana said, "You're right." And then she said, "Did she ask you about it afterward?" And I said, "Yes." And Dana said, Did she ask you about it? Yep. "Did she ask you about it afterward?" And I said, "Yes." And Dana said, 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 "What did she say?" And I told her, and Dana was quiet for a long time. And when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, and she said, "God, I didn't know she was carrying that." And I said, "That's the thing, Dana. They carry things we don't know about because we don't always think to ask." Nora asked me a few weeks later if we were still going to see Aunt Dana, and I said yes, when it felt right. And she said, "I'm not mad at her." And I said, "I know." And she said, "I just don't want her to say things like that again." And I said, "I have talked to her about that." And Nora said, "Okay." And then she said, "Mom, why do people say things are jokes when they're not actually funny?" And I thought about that for a moment, the genuine philosophical weight of the question, and I said, "I think sometimes people use the word joke to give themselves an exit from something they said without thinking." And Nora considered this and said, "That seems cowardly." And I said, "Yes, it does rather." And she went back to whatever she had been doing with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who has received a satisfying answer and is ready to move on. And I stayed where I was for a moment thinking about 9-year-old me at a family gathering with something lodged in my chest that nobody came to remove. And 38-year-old me watching my daughter walk away from a hard thing with her head level and her footing steady. And thinking that the distance between those two children is not nothing, is in fact everything, is the whole point of all of it. Every difficult conversation and every packed bag and every call that took 4 days to make, and every time I chose to go find her instead of waiting to see if she would come to me, all of it adding up to a child who knows that when something lands wrong, there is someone who will sit next to her on the bed and ask the real question and wait for the real answer, and then drive her home through the dark without making her explain why she needed to go.